Okay. So, thank you for participating. You've gotten the questions beforehand. You had a chance to look at those. Are those all okay as far as you're concerned? Good. Okay. If at any point you don't want to answer something, it's fine. If you say I don't know, that's fine. There aren't any right answers here. We just want you to kind of tell it as you see. Okay? Cool?
Cool.
So, can you tell me about the community you grew up in?
Very, very southern, Bible Belt. You met someone, and the first thing you learn about them is where they go to church. And if you don't go to church, you probably don't know many people. And you're expected to hang out with your peers, and usually it's the peers that go to the same church as you.
Okay. So not a lot of social interaction outside of church.
Not really. A little bit through school, but that happened more later in life, as kids got older. But usually your first friends were your next door neighbors and the kids you met at church.
How would your family describe itself from a religious standpoint?
Not religious. Religion, they don't like that word. My parents consider themselves spiritual, but religiosity comes with the connotation of a lot of material trappings. So, for example, like Catholicism with all of the everything that goes into that, they would consider that a religion, but not a spirituality. So they considered themselves spiritual in that they learned the theology, they went to they deep dove into the scriptures and all that, but they didn't. Just because something wasn't okay with the religion doesn't mean it's not okay from the text. So it was more direct interpretation from text to practical thing than this is what has been done traditionally for centuries, if that makes sense.
Do you agree with that? Meaning, do you think of your family as not a religious family?
Yes.
Okay.
Was this something that your family kind of talked about openly with you?
Yeah. The family dinner was very important, and during family dinner, we would talk about anything and everything, and a lot of it was politics, a lot of it was religion. Those were the two main things, because they knew that because I was in the world, that I would be getting a lot of different opinions about everything and anything, and they wanted me to at least be familiar with where I came from, essentially.
The world meaning the secular world?
Yes. I mean, the idea behind the Christian faith is to be in the world but not of the world, and they were fine with me being in the world and having, if I wanted to dye my hair purple, that was fine. If I wanted to get whatever pierced, it was fine as long as they weren't paying for it. My mom still isn't crazy about tattoos, but she also knows that it's my life and it's what I want to do with it.
Okay. Did you go to a religious school?
Yes. From K3 through 4th grade, I went to a private Christian school. It was run by a different denomination, but there was still a Bible class, and we had chapel every Wednesday morning. But yeah, it was extremely small. Is the main thing I remember about it. It's the entire grade. I had the biggest class of the school, and we had 12 kids, and I didn't get on with most of them. But that's what it was, and they wanted me to at least be brought up in that climate. Is climate the right word? Culture? Environment, yeah. But coming from my parents, that also means that I couldn't really relate to a lot of the kids there because they were from more religious families, and my parents didn't consider it religion. I listen to classic rock music from early age, not, Christian radio all the time, So it made things a little weird.
Can I ask what happened after fourth grade? Because you said you went K3 to...
Yes. So the school that I went to taught from K3 through 12th grade, but the school was failing. It was started as a kind of a side project, basically, for a local Wesleyan church. But they didn't have the budget, they didn't have the funding. We were in a disgusting old school building that had more leaks in the roof than it did roof. And so it got to the point where they just couldn't keep the school open anymore. And after my fourth grade year was the year it closed, which led to a lot of interesting results later down the line. But
in terms of where you went to school after that?
yeah, because going to a tiny little private Christian school and then suddenly moved from that to public school, where my class size was like 250 kids. It's a little bit of a culture shock. And then, of course, I made friends with the first atheist I came across, and it kind of went sideways from there.
Back to before we move on, just about the school, you said it was a different denomination of Christianity than your house.
Yes.
What denomination was your house? What denomination was the school?
My denomination was PCA Presbyterian. The school itself was Wesleyan, Southern Wesleyan, specifically. I'm not sure, it's been years, but I still don't really quite know what the difference is.
So that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit, for people that might not know, can you just kind of explain a little bit why that would be a difference, just to the best of your knowledge?
It's small little theological things. Every large religion has its subcategories, essentially, of things that people bicker about. And that was, but my education at that school was not such that we got to that point. It was a religious school, but going through it at the time, even at the age I was, it felt very surface level. It didn't feel like there was a whole lot of application, especially in the younger kids. Like, teachers, maybe, sure, but students, no.
But it's not as if your school didn't consider your house Christian or something like that.
Oh, no, not at all. Yeah, it was just a different kind of Christian.
Understood. Okay.
Because only God knows the part.
Sure.
Once you were taken out of the religious school system, did your parents try to supplement your education in any sort of way?
That goes back to the family dinners, basically. I wasn't old enough quite yet for the traditional youth group. My sibling was, but that went poorly. And, we went to Sunday school, we went to church every Sunday, that sort of thing. But other than that, most of our learning was reading and talking around the dinner table.
Okay.
And I do feel like I got rather a deeper theological perspective because of that, rather than just going to church every Sunday, because that, a lot of the issue I have with the Southern culture and religion as a general is that everyone calls themselves Christian, but do they mean it? Like, they don't act like it. And that kind of, that's when I sort of started noticing, started paying attention, was about the time I changed from the private school to the public school.
Can you give me some examples of what you mean?
Kind of. This is a little bit of a long story, but my dad is a musician, and he used to play in the church band, and he did that for years. He used to love it, but people would see him on stage, and he would be like, he'd be celebrating. He would be enjoying the music because it is a form of worship for him. And they would bitch and complain because he looked too exuberant. And my family's a bunch of weirdos. We've always been a bunch of weirdos, and we didn't really fit neatly into the good Southern Christian box. So we weren't really, we weren't unwelcome, but we weren't welcome either. We just kind of, if we were there, then cool. If we weren't, nobody tried to figure out where we were. Like, we could probably have disappeared for months at a time and nobody would have said, like, nobody would have checked up. Which, it's not like when you're from a faith that's professes to be about love, that's not really, it doesn't work, you know? It's inconsistent.
How religious were your friends? And did you have friends from other faiths? And I'm assuming that answer is going to change when you went to public school. So
Yeah.
you can sort of do a before and after.
Very much so. At the private school, it was like everybody was Christian because their parents said they were Christian, you know? But I never saw any particular application of that. There weren't like deep theological discussions around the lunch table or whatever. And then I hit public school, and first friend I made was atheist. And that was interesting. That was the first time that I kind of took a look at my own faith. And I kept it, but I was definitely, like, I talked to her a bit. And of course, me being a good Christian girl, I tried to convert her, and that went sideways. But, like, we were able to remain friends once we just decided to let that slide past. We each thought the other was a cool person, despite it. And I was only friends with her for about a year because she moved after that, and I never saw her again. But it was definitely a kind of a, oh yes, I'm in a different field now, kind of deal. And then after that, over the years, I had, my best friend was Catholic. And I had, you know, friends from all kinds of different subdivisions of Christian, mostly. Once I hit high school, I had a few, like, agnostic friends. But pretty much everyone was baseline Christian because that's where I lived. And that sort of thing.
Were the friends that you mentioned that were atheists and agnostic, were they former Christians or were they raised that way?
The atheist was raised that way. The agnostics were former Christians. Some of them found Jesus again by themselves later. Some of them didn't. Just kind of depending.
Do you feel like there was some kind of a tipping point in your life where you knew that religion was not going to be the thing that guided most of your decision making anymore?
It never really did. That was the thing. Like, there were definitely there was some influence, like, sort of trains of thought where like, okay, if X is true, then Y must also be true, and Z is how I act. Like, there was a little bit of that, but for the most part, it was never really, like, first thought in my head. It was a, let's sit back and think about this kind of deal, if that makes sense. But, I don't know, as I got older and I started actually, like, I moved out of the house, I started living my own life kind of deal. And I stopped going to church as much because I was working on, like, I had to be at work on Sundays. And over time there was more of I started having existential crises of, like, I was working at Wendy's, am I really supposed to be, like, you go into work, you clock in, and you do your job and you leave. And then you go home to an empty apartment or an apartment with one roommate or something, and everyone kind of keeps to themselves. And I was just really depressed. I was not happy with where I was. And I just kept having these moments over and over again of, like, is this it? What even is my purpose? Like, for the catechisms that were taught as children, like catechism, I think it's like Catechism 1, is like, what is my purpose? And it is to serve and glorify God in everything you do. What does that mean? Like, yeah, I guess you can glorify God by flipping burgers, but the direct application isn't quite there so much. And it always felt like, it always felt like there was that was supposed to mean more than it did.
Do you feel like the axioms that you were handed didn't really help in real life, as it were? Real life in quotes, obviously, or your childhood's real life too.
A little bit, just kind of depending. Like there were definitely some navigational tools of just like how do I live my life.
Right.
But most of what I learned is that like that stuff doesn't matter. Like what I learned was a lesson of all things in balance, and that's not so much a Christian thing, because when you've got a religion, you've got things that you're not supposed to do. Whereas I have found that if you can navigate those if it's other people, it's through communication, if it's and respect, and if it's by yourself, then it's respect for yourself, and like learning who you are and how then to proceed. It's a matter of what boundaries work for each person, because not every boundary works for every person, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you started kind of having these existential crises. Where did you kind of turn at that point? If you felt that what you had been handed wasn't really enough, did you feel like you had some place to turn?
Not really. At that point, it got to the point where I couldn't talk to my parents about it, because they've been Christian for the last 35 years, and that they would just tell me to go back to church, start reading the Bible again, like stuff like that. They might not say it in those words, but like it would be, okay, find yourself a community of like-minded, because they thought I was still Christian, like-minded individuals who can help guide you. And that's basically the problem, is I never found a community in the church. Ever. Like, I was able to kind of shoehorn myself for a little bit. I played the game better than my sibling did, but it didn't work. Like, I didn't fit. I was too weird. Or like I asked too many questions, or sitting around at Sunday school and all the talk was like here and I wanted to be down there. Like I wanted to get into it, like, okay, so what does this mean? And that wasn't really an option, I felt like. So, I did what any young adult does. I poked around on the internet, I read some stuff, figured it out. Talked to my siblings talked a lot. Because they went through basically the same thing about 5 years before I did.
Okay.
Can you talk a little bit about the reactions from, let's say, some of the people at church when you would ask these questions, or when you would, quote, talk too much?
Blank stares. Lots of blank stares of like, what the fuck are you talking about kind of deal. I don't know, it got to the point where like, I almost felt like I couldn't ask questions in some cases, because this is just my anxiety coming into play, but it seemed like I felt like I was showing off. Like I know more about this than you do, kind of deal, and you're supposed to be the leader here. So like that was the main thing, and then a lot of like the church elders and people that I could have talked to that would have been more in the know, I just never was really comfortable around them. Like I went to my family did a lot of church bouncing after about the same time my school closed, actually,
Church bouncing.
church bouncing, yes. And there was one that we settled at for a while, and I don't know, just there was always something. It was never intentional, it was never malicious, but a lot of the elders in the church were just kind of creepy. I just didn't want to talk to them. Like they seemed like nice people over there.
Okay. So this is kind of a follow-up to what you said. You mentioned that you've not talked to your parents about this.
Yeah.
Not talked to your parents about this. You have talked to your sibling.
Yes.
Are there friends that do you feel comfortable talking about this with other members of your family, friends? Did you at some point have sort of situations where it's like you kind of came out? What was that like?
For the most part, we live in a society that is very just sort of, you don't talk about sex, you don't talk about religion, you don't talk about politics. So with friends, it doesn't really come up unless I get to know them very, very well. And if I've gotten to know them that well at that point, then it's not really an issue. But I was never really close with most of my family, so we had a core nuclear family, and that was very, very close. We used to be very tight knit. My folks, my sibling, and I. But extended family, I'd see them maybe once a year. Like I have first cousins that I haven't talked to in like 10 years, and it's not on purpose. It's just they lived far away, and it wasn't a huge priority. But yeah, no, I've never had a problem talking to friends. That's never been an issue. The only person who I ever really had to specifically come out to was my best friend, and that's just because we had talked extensively about it before I sort of went through all the things, and then and then we were just like we didn't talk for like a year. And then when we got back together, it was like, okay, so what's new? This is new, this is new, this is new. Also, I don't believe in God anymore.
At some point earlier, you mentioned that your sibling had kind of gone through this about 5 years before you did.
Very much.
Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that meant for your family or what that meant for you?
I don't know. It was. You and I are very similar people in just like our mannerisms, how we think, how we act. I am better at playing the game than they used to be. So I don't want to say I learned from their mistakes, but I kind of did, just in fitting in. Not that it was something I wanted to do, but everybody needs to have something when they're that age, any age. And when you're in the specific section of the world I was in, your options are very limited. Didn't settle. I did. So in some ways, I say kudos to them for the strength of that. But I don't know, it has affected both of us differently, but also the same. What was the original question?
I had asked kind of if you felt like them like leaving religion had affected your family in any way.
Oh, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I'm not out to my parents. Is because I saw how that kind of messed up my siblings' relationship with them. Because like my parents are good, they're good Christian people, so they see, oh, you're not a Christian, that sucks, that means you're going to hell. And whether it comes up regularly or not, that sadness is still there. And that wanting to change that decision is still there. Especially because we're their kids. Like, they want what's best for their kids. Or their interpretation of what is best for us, which may or may not be accurate.
So I'm just clarifying, your sibling and your parents are not speaking?
No.
Okay.
They are. My sibling no longer considers my parents family. My mom still checks in with them, I think, once in a while. But we had like a family group text chat that is no longer active. I now have one with my parents, and that is all. And once in a while, when I'm on my phone with my mom, she'll ask if I've heard any, like, are there any major updates and that sort of thing. Although really, I try not to give any information, any like big information, because it's not. If someone does not want them knowing, I do not want it to come from me. It just, I figure it's more respectful to let her explain where, like, how much she wants to, essentially, they want to.
Was that falling out between your sibling and your parents? Is that over theological stuff or something else?
It was not over religion. Religion is just where it started. It started with religion, and then it spread into politics because they went to a very they went to which is a very it's an art school in very prestigious, but they went for a writing program. It was they very much enjoyed it, but you go away to college and you come back with all these newfangled ideas. And then my dad got into it over dinner a few times, and so like you could see the schism developing. And then it got even worse. But it got worse when they came out as pansexual. And then what really kind of kicked it was coming out as non-binary, because that just is totally entirely against my parents' worldview. They are very much okay. You are the gender that you are born with, and at that, my dad thinks of it as a fad and a trend, and it'll go away. So seeing make all these life decisions based off of something that he thinks is not real, he started viewing it as sort of a mental disorder. And that it was a toxic environment. I don't blame them for getting out at all, even though it does make me sad. Because I liked having my family, they were all nicely in the same time, even if we were geographically far apart. But I for right now, with how my parents have been acting lately, it's been interesting as well moving out, because getting out of the South has changed my perspective a lot. And I am starting to see the toxic traits in my parents, like, very clearly. It happened especially badly last time they came out and visited. So I do not blame for the distance. It sucks, but I get it.
Okay. As a member or former member of, I guess, the Christian community, we can say, what do you think is the best and worst advice, if you've received any advice at all, about finding out that you're secular, coming out as secular?
I mean, it goes back to the whole concept of being in the world and not of the world. Like, what the fuck does that mean? You can just it's sort of, it's a weird phrase that you hear a lot in churches, and nobody really can give you a straight answer of what it means. But basically, you're supposed to live life, but not like succumb to the temptations of the world. So interpret that how you will, kind of, essentially. I have had secular Christian friends before, but I have a couple good friends who are still that. And they have historically been helpful in kind of navigating life, but nothing really with direct application. For me personally, at least.
Do you have any advice for somebody who's coming out of the Christian community?
Move away from home. That's if I have any advice to give literally anyone I ever meet, move away from home. See the world for yourself. Make your decisions from there.
How is your life different now? Do you feel like it's changed since abandoning your faith, or leaving your faith, or losing your faith, however you want to frame it?
I have to take a lot more responsibility for my life. Like, that is the point. It's not so much that I removed the safety net as I did sort of recognize that, oh no, there is no safety net. And I've always been very responsible about that sort of thing. Like, yes, God will look after me, but God doesn't pay the bills. But it's much more direct now of like, well, if the concept of eternal joy coming from God isn't a thing, then I have to make my own happiness in the world. I got a cat. That gives me a reason to smile every day. If everything else could go to hell, but I have a small kitten waiting for me at home who is happy to see me when I walk in the door. And like finding the joy in the everyday, much more so than trying to connect it with some being who, if he exists, doesn't give a shit. Or appears to not give a shit.
What would you say your stance is on religion now? How would you describe yourself?
I think that it is helpful for a lot of people. It is just not for me. There's a song lyric that I really like. I think is well written. It's I don't have faith in faith. I don't believe in beliefs. You can call me faithless, but I still cling to hope, and I believe in love, and that's faith enough for me. And that's kind of, I figure that's good enough for me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this video. If you would like to participate in the Secular Stories project, feel free to reach out via the email in the description below or through Facebook at Modern Contemplations. Participation can be completely anonymous and your identity can be protected. Thanks. Bye.